A flickering candle illuminated a room full of gold for the first time in 3,000 years. Howard Carter peered into the darkness and saw wonderful things. That moment in 1922 became one of the most famous discoveries in history. But the true story of what they really found inside King Tut's tomb is far more mysterious and shocking than the glittering mask suggests. By the end of this, you will understand the hidden secrets, the political battles, and the scientific revelations that transformed a pile of treasure into a window on a lost world. Why was the young king's heart missing from his mummy, and how did a dagger made from a fallen star end up on his body? What do you believe is the greatest mystery left behind by the ancient world? But behind every great discovery is a human story of obsession and desperation. For Howard Carter, the search for Tutankhamun was not a glorious adventure but a grueling 9-year gamble. He was a stubborn, meticulous man, an artist-turned-archaeologist who believed with every fiber of his being that an untouched royal tomb still lay hidden beneath the valley's rubble. His patron was the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a wealthy English aristocrat with a passion for fast cars and ancient history. Carnarvon's money funded the dig, but Carter's relentless drive provided the vision. By 1922, their partnership was on the brink of collapse. They had excavated vast sections of the Valley of the Kings, a place thought to be exhausted, picked clean by tomb robbers and earlier archaeologists. The common wisdom was clear: every pharaoh's resting place had been found or looted centuries ago. The idea of discovering a completely intact burial was considered a fantasy, a fool's errand. Season after season yielded only fragments and disappointment. Lord Carnarvon was losing patience and his fortune. He summoned Carter to his English estate and delivered an ultimatum: one final season of digging. If they found nothing, the funding would end for good. Carter, facing the ruin of his life's work, convinced his patron to grant him one last chance, to dig in one small, overlooked area near the entrance to another tomb. It was a final, desperate roll of the dice. The pressure was immense, the stakes could not have been higher. And so, with a small team of workers, Howard Carter returned to Egypt in November of 1922, not knowing he was just days away from changing history forever. The morning of November 4th was just another day of hard labor under the Egyptian sun. The crew was clearing away ancient workmen's huts, a routine task, when a young water boy named Hussein Abdul Rasul made a discovery that seemed almost too small to notice. His foot struck something solid just beneath the sand, a single stone step carved directly into the bedrock. With frantic care, Carter and his team began to dig, their hands moving with a new, electric urgency. More steps emerged, a staircase descending into the heart of the valley. Hour by hour, they revealed a steep flight of 16 steps, ending at the upper part of a sealed doorway, plastered over and stamped with the circular impressions of the royal necropolis seal. This was the official mark of the tomb inspectors, a sign that a king had been buried here. The air itself seemed to thicken with possibility, yet the door also showed signs of a breach, an ancient break-in near the top that had been carefully resealed. This tomb had not been left entirely alone. The question now was, had the thieves taken everything? Howard Carter faced an impossible dilemma. The rules of proper archaeology and his own agreement with Lord Carnarvon were absolute. He could not break the seal without his patron present, so, with superhuman restraint, he ordered his workmen to refill the staircase, posted armed guards, and sent the most famous telegram in archaeological history across the wires to England. It read, "At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered same for your arrival, congratulations." For 3 long weeks, Carter waited, protecting the secret, staring at that buried doorway every night in his dreams, while Carnarvon rushed to assemble a team and make the long journey from England. It was a torturous pause, a silence filled with the whispers of what might lie just beyond that ancient plaster. Finally, Lord Carnarvon arrived. The tension was almost unbearable. On the morning of November 26, 1922, with the staircase cleared once more, the two men stood before the ancient sealed door. This time they would open it. Carter carefully chipped away at the plaster around the ancient breach near the top, his hands steady despite the pounding of his heart. He made a small hole just large enough to peer through. The air that escaped was warm and carried the faint, dry scent of antiquity, 3,000 years of stillness disturbed. Carnarvon, standing beside him in the dim passageway, could wait no longer. He asked the question that hung in the dusty air, "Can you see anything?" Carter, holding a flickering candle to the opening, was silent for a long moment as his eyes adjusted. Then the words that would echo through history tumbled out, breathless with awe. "Yes," he whispered, "wonderful things." He later wrote that details of the room slowly emerged from the mist, strange animals, statues, and gold, everywhere the glint of gold. They widened the hole, the candlelight danced across a scene of chaotic splendor. This was not the burial chamber itself, but the antechamber, a waiting room for eternity that had been packed to the ceiling. The space was not large, perhaps the size of a modest living room, but every inch was crammed with objects. There were 3 massive gilded couches, their sides carved into the shapes of fantastical beasts, a hippopotamus goddess, a lion, and a cow. They were piled high with boxes and chests. Life-sized guardian statues stood watch, their faces painted with a striking black and gold solemnity. The disassembled parts of chariots, glinting with gold leaf, were stacked against the wall. Alabaster vases, intricately carved furniture, and what looked like a jumble of beds were all heaped together in a breathtaking, bewildering jumble. The sheer volume was staggering. This was not a curated museum display. It was a royal garage sale for the afterlife, a desperate effort to send the young king into the next world with absolutely everything he might need. In that first, gasping moment, the true magnitude of their find crashed over them. The seals on the outer door had been broken and resealed in antiquity, yes, but the chaos inside was not the work of thieves. It was the original, frantic packing job by the royal burial party. They were the first people to lay eyes on this room since it was sealed over 3 millennia ago. Every object, every flake of gold was exactly where the ancient priests had left it. The treasure was real, and it was utterly, magnificently untouched. Gold gleamed from every shadow in that cramped space. The first room, the antechamber, was less a formal hall and more a royal attic, stuffed to its limestone rafters with a breathtaking jumble of necessities for the eternal journey. Dominating the far wall stood 2 life-sized statues of the king himself, carved from black wood and coated in a shimmering layer of gold. Their faces, painted with solemn coal-lined eyes, stared eternally forward, guarding the sealed doorway that led deeper into the tomb. They were not alone in their vigil. To the left, 3 massive ceremonial couches took up much of the floor space, each a masterpiece of art and symbolism. Their sides were carved into the forms of sacred animals, a cow representing the goddess Hathor, a lioness for the fierce Sekhmet, and a hybrid creature with the head of a hippopotamus, the body of a lion, and the tail of a crocodile, representing the chaos-devouring god Ammit. These were not for resting, but for ritual, and they were piled high with baskets, chests, and linens. Tucked against another wall were the disassembled parts of the king's chariots, their wooden frames sheathed in gold leaf and inlaid with brilliant colored glass and stone. They were not parked neatly, but stacked like pieces of an impossibly expensive puzzle, ready to be reassembled for royal processions in the afterlife. Scattered throughout the room were dozens of alabaster vessels, their translucent white stone glowing softly in the candlelight. These elegant jars held precious oils and perfumes meant to anoint the king for eternity. Everywhere Carter looked, there were ornate boxes, some shaped like miniature shrines, others decorated with scenes of hunting and warfare. One, a beautifully painted casket, showed the young Tutankhamun in his chariot, arrows flying, hunting ostriches across the desert. This chaotic pile was not carelessness, it was a frantic, functional packing job. The ancient priests had a single goal: to seal the king away with every object, every tool, every symbol of power he could possibly require. They were not arranging a museum exhibit, they were stocking a supernatural survival kit, and they packed the antechamber until not a single inch of floor remained visible. The sheer overwhelming density of it all told a story of urgency, of a burial performed with reverence, but also with a desperate need to get everything inside before the tomb was sealed forever. But the antechamber was just the beginning. Squeezed into the far right wall was the entrance to a second, even smaller room, a space so packed it felt like opening a long-forgotten closet in a palace. Carter named it the Annex, and stepping inside was like walking into a pharaoh's pantry, armory, and linen closet all at once. This was the overflow room where the burial party had shoved everything that would not fit in the main chamber. The chaos here was even more intimate, more personal. Over 50 large storage boxes were stacked haphazardly, each one a treasure chest of the mundane and the magnificent. They were filled with food for the king's eternal journey, dozens of loaves of bread still preserved in their desiccated state, their shapes recognizable after 3,000 years. There were sealed jars of wine, many with their vintage and vineyard still marked on the clay lids, a royal wine cellar for the afterlife. Alabaster vessels held precious perfumes and sacred oils, their faint, ghostly scents perhaps still lingering in the sealed stone. Alongside these provisions was a stunning collection of royal regalia, the personal items of a young king. There were ornate fans made from ostrich feathers and ebony, their handles sheathed in gold, ready to cool the pharaoh in the next world. A collection of beautifully carved walking staves and scepters spoke of his authority, but perhaps most telling were the objects of daily life, beds and stools inlaid with ivory, and a fleet of model boats, intricate miniatures crafted from wood. These were not toys, but magical replicas intended to transform into full-sized vessels to carry the king's spirit across the celestial waters. The annex was not about monumental gold, it was about sustenance and ritual, about the tangible, physical needs of a person believed to be traveling to another realm. In that jumble of bread, wine, and walking sticks, the ancient Egyptians ceased to be distant gods carved in stone. They became people who packed lunches for the ultimate trip, who believed a model boat could become real through magic, and who ensured their king would never be hungry, thirsty, or without his favorite staff. This room, more than any other, provided a breathtakingly human snapshot, a frozen moment of practical love and profound belief sealed in darkness for 30 centuries. Yet for all the overwhelming splendor of those outer rooms, they were merely the vestibule. The true heart of the tomb, the king's final resting place, lay hidden behind the sealed doorway guarded by those two solemn golden statues. For weeks, Carter and his team could only work in the antechamber, meticulously cataloging and clearing the mountain of objects that stood between them and that wall. It was a slow, delicate dance, each artifact requiring careful photography, documentation, and preservation before it could be moved. The anticipation was a physical presence in the hot, still air. Every worker, every scientist knew they were inching closer to the ultimate prize, the burial chamber itself. Finally, in mid-February of 1923, the last box was removed. For the first time, the entire sealed doorway stood exposed, a blank plaster wall stamped with the necropolis seals. This was the moment of truth. With his team gathered behind him, Howard Carter approached the wall. He chose a spot near the top where the plaster looked thinnest and began to carefully chip away with a chisel. The sound of the tapping tool echoed in the silent room. He worked slowly, making a hole just large enough to slip a slender electric light through. He later wrote that the first thing he saw was what appeared to be a wall of solid, gleaming gold. His mind raced. Was it a statue, a sarcophagus? He widened the hole slightly and pushed the light further in. The beam swept across the most astonishing sight he had ever witnessed. It was not a statue, but an enormous, ornate box that nearly filled the entire chamber. This was the outermost shrine, a gigantic gilded wooden canopy built to protect the king's body. It was covered in brilliant blue faience inlay and hieroglyphs, and it reached almost to the ceiling. The space between this golden wall and the chamber's limestone walls was mere inches, a claustrophobic gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. The air that escaped was different, warmer and strangely heavy, carrying the distinct scent of ancient wood and embalming resins. They had found the core. But now came an even greater challenge. To reach the king, they had to dismantle the entire blocking wall, and then somehow navigate the narrow passage to open that gigantic shrine. It was a puzzle of physical logistics and immense pressure. They couldn't simply knock the wall down. Risk of damaging the golden shrine behind it was too great. So they painstakingly removed the stones from the top down, passing each one hand over hand out of the chamber, a human chain moving with reverent care. When the opening was finally large enough, Carter and Carnarvon slipped inside, entering a space that felt more like a sacred vault than a room. They stood in that dark, narrow gap, their shoulders almost brushing both the cold stone of the mountain and the warm, gleaming gold of the shrine. The silence was absolute, thick with the weight of centuries. They were now closer to the pharaoh than anyone had been for over 3,000 years, separated from him only by the doors of a series of nested shrines. The real work, the delicate, monumental task of opening these golden boxes, was about to begin. This was a puzzle box built on a colossal scale. The object that had first appeared as a wall of gold was in fact the outermost of 4 gigantic shrines, each one nestled perfectly inside the next like a set of sacred Russian dolls. They filled the burial chamber from wall to wall and nearly floor to ceiling, leaving only those narrow, claustrophobic walkways for the modern team to squeeze through. Each shrine was a masterpiece of ancient carpentry, constructed from thick planks of imported cedar and cypress wood, then entirely overlaid with sheets of brilliant gold foil. Their surfaces were a tapestry of divine protection, covered in intricate hieroglyphs and vivid scenes of gods and goddesses, their arms outstretched in a perpetual gesture of safeguarding. This was not just decoration, it was a magical fortress. The Egyptians believed the king's journey to the afterlife was perilous, filled with demons and chaotic forces. Each shrine represented a successive layer of sacred insulation, a barrier against spiritual corruption. To reach the king, one would have to pass through 4 separate zones of holy ground, each one consecrated by spells and divine imagery. The innermost shrine was considered the holiest of all, a microcosm of the universe itself where the pharaoh would undergo his rebirth. But for Carter and his team, this theological marvel presented an almost insurmountable physical challenge. The burial chamber was oppressively hot and stuffy, the air thick with the dust of millennia. The space between the outer shrine and the stone walls was in many places less than 2 feet wide, just enough for a single person to stand sideways. There were no modern tools for this job, no cranes or hydraulic lifts. Every action had to be performed with agonizing care by hand. Their task was to dismantle these enormous structures, piece by precious piece, without causing a single scratch or dent. They began with the massive double doors of the outermost shrine, which were sealed with simple but ancient copper bolts. With the gentlest pressure, Carter slid these bolts back, a sound that had not been heard for 3,200 years. The doors creaked open on dry wooden hinges, revealing the second shrine within, and so the meticulous process began. Each shrine had to be carefully measured, photographed, and documented in its original position. Then the team had to figure out how to lift the enormous gilded roof panels, some weighing hundreds of pounds, up and out through the narrow gaps without swinging them into the priceless walls. They constructed a complex system of block and tackle, rigging pulleys from wooden beams they braced against the ceiling. The work was exhausting, performed in a sauna-like heat where every movement had to be deliberate and coordinated. A single slip could mean the destruction of an irreplaceable artifact. It took them 84 days of relentless, painstaking effort just to reach the innermost shrine. When they finally lifted the last golden roof panel, they were met not with the king but with a breathtaking sight. A sheer linen pall, dyed a rich reddish brown and adorned with golden rosettes, still lay perfectly draped over a rectangular stone box. The delicate fabric, protected in the absolute darkness and dry air, had survived intact. For a moment, they simply stared, realizing they were the first to see this sacred shroud since it was laid there by grieving priests. Underneath it, they knew, was the sarcophagus. The months of grueling labor had peeled back the layers of a divine onion, and now they stood at its very heart. Beneath the delicate linen shroud lay the object of their entire quest, the king's final stone bed. It was a sarcophagus carved from a single, massive block of beautiful red quartzite, a stone chosen not just for its durability but for its symbolic power. In ancient Egyptian belief, red was the color of the life-giving sun and of blood, representing both rebirth and the protective fury of the goddess Isis. The stone itself seemed to glow with a warm, deep hue in the lamplight, a stark and solemn contrast to the brilliant gold that surrounded it. The craftsmanship was breathtaking. Each of the four corners was guarded by a carved relief of a protective goddess, her wings outstretched in an eternal embrace around the coffin. These were not just decorations, they were the deities Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Selket, the same four goddesses whose shrines had held the king's internal organs. Their presence here meant that even the stone container itself was a sacred fortress, watched over by the most powerful guardians in the Egyptian pantheon. Yet this perfect artifact bore a shocking flaw. Running diagonally across the massive lid was a distinct, jagged crack. The sight must have sent a chill through Carter's heart. This was not damage from the weight of centuries. It was a clean, ancient break that had been crudely repaired with plaster. Someone, long ago, had broken into this innermost sanctum. The pristine outer seals had been a ruse, the untouched antechamber a magnificent distraction. Thieves had reached the very heart of the tomb, stood before this sarcophagus and shattered its lid. The question now was terrifyingly simple. Had they been interrupted by priests, leaving the king's mummy and its golden treasures within? Or had they stripped the coffin bare, leaving Carter and his team with nothing but an empty, broken stone box after years of effort? All the wonder of the previous months narrowed to this single, tense moment. The magnificent shrines, the piles of gold, the sealed doorways, every step had led to this cracked slab of red stone. The real discovery, the truth about King Tutankhamun, was waiting on the other side of that damaged lid. The cracked quartzite lid weighed over 1.5 tons. Hoisting it free from the sarcophagus was the most delicate operation yet, a feat of ropes and pulleys in that suffocating space. As the massive slab rose inch by groaning inch, a collective breath was held. The electric light plunged into the darkness below, and a gasp echoed in the chamber. They were not looking at a mummy, they were looking at a face of solid gold. Nestled perfectly within the stone box was an anthropoid coffin, a magnificent human-shaped casket carved from wood and covered in a skin of thick, burnished gold. It was a portrait of the king in his divine form, lying in serene repose. His arms were crossed over his chest in the traditional pose of Osiris, god of the afterlife, each hand clutching the royal crook and flail, symbols of his authority. The face was a masterpiece of calm majesty, crafted from gold so pure it seemed to generate its own light in the shadows, but it was the details that stole all reason. The eyelids and eyebrows were inlaid with brilliant blue lapis lazuli. A ceremonial beard symbolizing divinity was attached to the chin. Across the body, a dazzling mosaic of colored glass and semi-precious stones formed intricate patterns and hieroglyphs, spells from the Book of the Dead woven into a protective cloak of gemstones. The sheer, blinding opulence was almost impossible to process. Yet even in this moment of utter triumph, Howard Carter noticed something profoundly strange. The gorgeous golden face was covered in a coarse, black, resin-like substance. It was as if the coffin had been drenched in a sacred oil as part of the burial rite, anointing it for eternity. This, however, was just the beginning of the shock. As the team carefully cleared the residue and examined the coffin, they realized this breathtaking golden shell was not the end. It was merely the outermost layer. There were fittings and pins along its sides, indicating it was designed to be opened. Inside this golden coffin, they would soon learn, was another. And inside that one, another still. The world had marveled at a single golden coffin, but Tutankhamun had been given three, each one nested within the last like the layers of his sacred shrines. The magnitude of the investment, the sheer volume of gold and artistry devoted to this one young king, began to sink in, rewriting everything anyone thought they knew about the wealth and devotion of this forgotten era. The golden face was merely the outermost shell. With the same meticulous care used on the shrines, the team set to work releasing the heavy lid of this first magnificent coffin. The pins along its side were freed, and the lid, a solid sheet of gold over a wooden core, was lifted. Inside, nestled perfectly within the contours of the first, lay a second coffin. It took their breath away. If the first coffin was a masterpiece, this one was a miracle. It was also anthropoid, also sheathed in gold, but the craftsmanship was even more exquisite, more detailed. The gold here was worked with such skill that it seemed like fabric, capturing the delicate pleats of a royal headdress, the fine lines of a necklace, the subtle curves of the king's youthful face. This coffin was a riot of color, covered in an intricate inlay of brilliant red carnelian, vibrant blue lapis lazuli, and cool green turquoise, all set into the gold to form dazzling patterns of feathers, meant to mimic the wings of protective goddesses wrapping the king's body. But resting upon the chest of this golden effigy was something that stopped the archaeologists cold. It was a small, fragile garland of flowers, woven from olive leaves and blue cornflowers, their petals still retaining a whisper of color after 30 centuries. This was not part of the official royal regalia. This was a last-minute, deeply personal tribute placed there by a grieving mourner, perhaps his young wife or a close friend, just before the final lid was closed. It was a shocking touch of humanity in a chamber of overwhelming divinity, a simple, poignant farewell that bridged the millennia in an instant. Yet this beautiful gesture had also created a profound problem for the excavators. The black resin they had noted on the first coffin had been poured in a liquid state over this second one as well, a sacred anointing that had seeped into every crevice. Over the ages, it had hardened into a rock-solid adhesive, fusing the two coffins together into a single, impossibly heavy and delicate block. They could not simply lift the inner coffin out. They were faced with a conservation nightmare, needing to separate these priceless, fragile objects without destroying either one. The heat in the chamber was now a stifling enemy, and the pressure to proceed without error was immense. After all they had overcome, the king's body was still separated from them by a layer of gold, a layer of hardened history, and a wreath of flowers that spoke of a love as enduring as stone. The two coffins were fused together by that hardened black resin, a single, immovable mass of gold and history. There was only one way forward, a solution that must have felt like sacrilege. Under the hot electric lights, they carefully applied gentle heat, using the warm air from incandescent light bulbs to slowly, agonizingly soften the ancient adhesive. It took hours, a tense and delicate process of warming and prying, until finally, with a soft sigh, the inner coffin broke free from its golden shell. As they lifted it clear and placed it upon a waiting trestle, the true weight of the object became apparent. It was astonishingly, impossibly heavy. This was not gold foil over wood. The third and final coffin, revealed at last, was made from 110 kilograms of solid hammered gold. To put that in perspective, that is 240 pounds of pure, precious metal, a fortune so vast it would be worth millions upon millions today just as raw material. But to the ancient Egyptians, its value was infinitely greater. This was the ultimate divine vessel, the final and most sacred layer between the world and the king's mortal remains. The craftsmanship was beyond anything they had yet seen. The gold had been worked into the perfect, serene likeness of Tutankhamun as the god Osiris, ruler of the underworld. His face was younger, more delicate than the masks of the outer coffins, perhaps a truer portrait of the boy who died. He wore the striped Nemes headcloth, its lappets falling over the shoulders, and the graceful ceremonial beard. His crossed hands, also of solid gold, once again held the crook and flail, but here they were inlaid with brilliant blue glass to mimic the grip of lapis lazuli. The entire surface was a tapestry of minute detail, engraved with the finest hieroglyphs and protective symbols, and inlaid with vibrant bands of colored glass and semi-precious stone. This was not just a container, it was a statement of absolute, unassailable power. In a world where gold was considered the flesh of the gods, this coffin was the ultimate affirmation. It declared that this king was not merely a man buried with treasure. He was a divine being, eternally encased in the very substance of the sun itself, protected for all time by the most indestructible, most sacred material their civilization could conceive. All the toil, all the expectation had led to this solid gold effigy, but now the most intimate question of all remained. After 3,000 years, what condition was the king himself in? The solid gold coffin lid weighed nearly as much as a full-grown man. With the same reverent care, the team lifted it, and the air in the chamber seemed to still. Inside lay the mummy of Tutankhamun, but it was not the pristine, linen-wrapped figure one might expect. Instead, they were met with a shocking sight, a dark, hardened, and almost tragic mass. The sacred libation oils poured in such abundance during the burial rites had not simply anointed the king, they had entombed him in a chemical disaster. Over 3 millennia, the resins had pooled and hardened into a solid black shell, essentially baking the royal remains in their own ceremonial glue. The mummy was fused irrevocably to the bottom of its golden coffin, a single, inseparable unit of history and decay. To the archaeologists, it was immediately clear extracting the body would be an act of brutal necessity, not gentle unwrapping. The very substances meant to grant eternal preservation had instead created a sarcophagus within a sarcophagus, one that threatened to destroy the king it was meant to protect. The task of examining the mummy fell to the team's anatomist, Douglas Derry, assisted by Carter. Their goal was scientific, to learn everything they could about the pharaoh's age, health, and cause of death. But the methods available in 1925 were shockingly crude by today's standards. The hardened resin was like rock. They had no delicate solvents or precision tools for such a situation. So they did what seemed necessary at the time. They used chisels and hot knives. They applied searing heat directly to the mummy's outer layers in an attempt to soften the pitch-like glue. In some places, they simply sawed through the mass. It was a destructive, almost violent process, born of a frustrating lack of modern conservation techniques. As they worked, the true tragedy became apparent. The king's body was not just stuck, it was terribly damaged. The skull had been separated from the spine, the limbs were disjointed, and much of the chest cavity was a crumbling ruin. For decades, many assumed this was the work of the ancient tomb robbers, a final act of desecration. But modern analysis tells a different, more poignant story. The extensive damage was likely caused by the excavators themselves during that brutal extraction. In their zeal to reach the historical truth, they had inadvertently inflicted wounds upon the very subject they sought to honor. Yet within that carbonized shell, glimmers of the king's former glory still shone. As the team painstakingly picked away at the resin-soaked bandages, treasures began to emerge. Nestled against the skin, woven into the very fabric of the wrappings, was a fortune in protective magic. Over 143 amulets and pieces of jewelry were discovered on the body itself. There were gold finger and toe stalls, sheaths to protect his digits in the afterlife. Brilliant pectorals, wide necklaces of gold and faience lay upon his chest. Scarab beetles carved from precious stone promised rebirth. 2 daggers were found, one with a blade of gleaming gold, the other with a blade of iron, a metal so rare in the Bronze Age it was considered more precious than gold itself. And then, resting directly on the shoulders of the mummy, was the object that would become the single most famous artifact from the ancient world, the death mask. But this was not a separate piece placed on top. It was the outermost layer of the mummy's own bindings, the final face he would present to eternity. Weighing over 22 pounds of solid gold, inlaid with obsidian, quartz, and lapis lazuli, it depicted the king as a perfect, serene god. Its craftsmanship was so sublime, its gaze so tranquil, that it instantly transformed the damaged, resin-soaked body beneath into an icon of immortal beauty. The mask was a breathtaking contradiction, a shield of divine perfection hiding a reality of fragile, damaged humanity. That mask is a masterpiece of deception and devotion. Crafted from 2 thick sheets of hammered gold, it was not a solid casting but a sculptor's tour de force, shaped and soldered with a precision that still defies belief. The face is a serene, idealized portrait of the young king, but every element is a coded message for the gods. The striped headcloth, or nemes, is inlaid with stripes of brilliant blue lapis lazuli, a stone imported from distant Afghanistan, representing the night sky and the heavenly waters. The broad collar that covers the shoulders is a mosaic of thousands of tiny pieces of lapis, red carnelian, and green feldspar, mimicking the beads of a real necklace that would shimmer with every breath. The eyes are startlingly lifelike, outlined in brilliant blue lapis and crafted from translucent white quartz with obsidian pupils, so they seem to hold a depth and consciousness even in the still gold. This was not merely a portrait, it was a transformative device. In putting on this mask, Tutankhamun shed his mortal identity and became the god Osiris, lord of the afterlife and ruler of the dead. The crook and flail held in his crossed hands on the coffin were the symbols of Osiris, and the mask's serene, unwavering gaze was that of a deity ready for rebirth. This object was the ultimate insurance policy for eternity, designed to ensure the gods would recognize the king's divine nature and grant him passage into the immortal fields. Yet for all its divine purpose, the mask carries a very human flaw. Look closely at the right ear and you will see a small, rough puncture in the gold lobe, a place where a precious earring would have been attached. This damage was almost certainly not ancient. During the difficult extraction of the mummy from its resin-filled coffin, Carter's team likely hooked a tool into this delicate part of the mask to gain leverage, leaving this tiny, permanent scar of modern discovery upon the ancient face. It is a quiet reminder that even the most careful hands are still human and that the past is fragile. The magic of the mask is not only on its front. On the back and shoulders, a hieroglyphic spell is meticulously engraved, a passage from the Book of the Dead. It is a spell of protection, specifically for the limbs and head of the deceased, invoking the goddesses of the north, south, east, and west to guard the king's body. So the mask was a literal shield, its golden front presenting a divine face to the world, its inscribed back casting a magical barrier against any force that might threaten the king's journey. It is both art and armor, a portrait and a prayer, all forged from the flesh of the gods themselves. While the burial chamber held the king's body, the true spiritual machinery of his afterlife lay in a separate room entirely. To the right of the burial chamber, a small doorway led into a space Carter named the treasury. This was not a room of gold for wealth's sake, but a sacred workshop stocked with the divine tools necessary for resurrection. The air here felt different, charged with a sense of solemn ritual. Dominating the center of the room was an enormous, gilded wooden shrine shaped like a miniature chapel. Inside this shrine, resting on a silver sledge, was a breathtaking alabaster chest. This was the canopic shrine, and within it lay one of the most intimate and sacred sets of objects from the ancient world. The chest contained 4 separate compartments, and in each rested a miniature coffin of solid gold, each one a tiny masterpiece depicting the young king's face. These coffins held Tutankhamun's embalmed liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines. During mummification, these organs were removed, preserved in salts and resins, and then entrusted to the protection of 4 specific goddesses: Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Selket. Each goddess was represented by a stunning golden statue that stood guard at one corner of the larger shrine, her arms outstretched in a protective embrace around the chest that held her charge. This was the king's internal universe, preserved and divinely guarded, so that he could be physically and spiritually whole in the next life. But the treasury held more than just the king's organs. Watching over this entire sacred operation from atop its own black shrine was a statue of the god Anubis. It was a life-sized figure of a crouching jackal, carved from wood and covered in a layer of gleaming black resin, its eyes inlaid with gold and calcite, and its ears perked in eternal vigilance. Anubis was the god of embalming and the guardian of the necropolis, and his presence here was a powerful statement. He was not just a decoration, he was the divine sentinel, appointed to protect this holy cache for all eternity. Scattered throughout the room were other essentials for the perilous journey ahead. A fleet of model boats, some with full crews of tiny oarsmen, were ready to carry the king's spirit across the celestial waters, just as the sun god Ra traveled across the sky each day. And then there were the Shabti, row upon row, army upon army, of small servant figures carved from wood, stone, and faience. They stood in their own miniature coffins, many holding tiny agricultural tools. Their purpose was magical and practical, inscribed with a spell that commanded them to answer the call if the king was summoned to perform manual labor in the afterlife. There were over 400 of them, an entire workforce to ensure Tutankhamun would enjoy eternal leisure. This room, perhaps more than any other, reveals the ancient Egyptian mind at its most profound and practical. They prepared for the afterlife with a lawyer's thoroughness and a poet's faith, leaving nothing to chance. Every organ had a guardian, every journey had a vessel, and every chore had a magical substitute. The treasury was the meticulously stocked supply closet for immortality, proving that their quest for eternity was not a vague hope, but a detailed, actionable plan. Gold and glory were not the only discoveries to escape that sealed doorway. A far more sinister story emerged, one written not in hieroglyphs but in screaming newspaper headlines. It became known as the Curse of the Pharaoh, a tale of supernatural vengeance that captivated a world still reeling from the horrors of the First World War and hungry for mystery. The spark came just months after the burial chamber was opened. Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's aristocratic patron, fell ill in Cairo. He had nicked a mosquito bite on his cheek while shaving. The wound became infected and he developed blood poisoning. On April 5, 1923, he died in a hotel room. The lights of Cairo reportedly flickered out at the exact moment of his death, and back in England, his favorite dog was said to have howled and dropped dead simultaneously. The press, particularly the sensationalist papers, seized upon these eerie details with feverish delight. They connected Carnarvon's death to a supposed inscription found in the tomb, a warning that death would come on swift wings to those who disturbed the pharaoh's rest. Never mind that no such inscription was ever actually recorded by Carter or his team. The legend was too perfect to resist. Other deaths were quickly added to the grisly tally. A friend present at the opening died of a mysterious illness. Carnarvon's half-brother passed away unexpectedly. An American financier who had visited the tomb reportedly committed suicide. Even the death of a canary was woven into the myth, said to have been eaten by a cobra, the symbol of Egyptian royalty, on the day the tomb was breached. The story wrote itself, a gothic thriller of ancient magic punishing modern arrogance. Yet the reality is far less cinematic and far more revealing about the power of media myth. Look at the actual statistics. Howard Carter, the man who first breached the tomb and handled the mummy, lived for another 16 years, dying of natural causes at the age of 64. His head conservator, Alfred Lucas, worked intimately with the artifacts for a decade and lived to be 79. Most members of the core excavation team enjoyed long, ordinary lives. The so-called curse victims were overwhelmingly individuals who had only peripheral connections to the tomb, and their deaths from common causes like pneumonia or infection were twisted to fit the narrative. In an age before antibiotics, a simple infected cut was often a death sentence, as it was for Carnarvon. The curse was a perfect storm of coincidence and cultural anxiety. The 1920s were a time of massive social change and a growing fascination with the occult. The story tapped into a deep-seated fear that modern science had gone too far, that prying into sacred secrets would bring retribution. Newspapers sold copies, Hollywood made movies, and the public devoured the tale. The curse, in the end, tells us less about ancient Egypt and more about the modern world's need to cloak a staggering scientific achievement in the comforting, familiar robes of a ghost story. It was the shadow the treasure cast, a phantom narrative that ensured Tutankhamun's name would resonate not just in history books but in the realm of enduring legend. Yet for all its mythic power, the curse was a distraction from a far more consequential drama unfolding in the real world. The discovery of the century instantly triggered a battle over ownership, a clash of colonial attitudes and rising nationalism that would redefine who history belongs to. Under the system in place at the time, the standard practice for foreign excavations was a 50-50 split. The Egyptian Antiquities Service and the excavator's patron, in this case Lord Carnarvon's estate, would divide the find. This was how museums across Europe and America had built their Egyptian collections. Carnarvon and Carter fully expected this arrangement to apply to Tutankhamun's tomb. In their view, the riches were a rightful reward for their perseverance and financial risk. They envisioned a magnificent selection of objects leaving Egypt for Hickler Castle, Carnarvon's English home, and for museums that had supported the work. But the sheer, unprecedented scale of the find changed everything. This was not a typical tomb with a few statues and pots. This was an intact pharaonic burial of unimaginable wealth, the only one ever discovered. For the Egyptian people and their government, which had recently gained a fragile independence from British control, Tutankhamun became a potent symbol of national identity and pride. He was not a curiosity to be exported, he was a founding father, and his treasures were the patrimony of a newly sovereign nation. Public sentiment turned sharply against the idea of any division. The Egyptian authorities, led by the Minister of Public Works Pierre Lacow, took a firm stance. Citing the unique and incomparable nature of the discovery, they argued that the standard practice should not apply. The entire collection, they declared, must remain in Egypt. For Howard Carter, this was a devastating betrayal. He saw it as a breach of contract and a personal insult to the memory of Lord Carnarvon, who had funded the search. Tensions reached a breaking point in February of 1924. After a dispute over visitor access to the tomb, the Egyptian government revoked Carter's excavation permit and locked him out of his own discovery. In a fit of fury, Carter initiated a lawsuit against the government. He even took the drastic step of closing the tomb and padlocking the iron gate, leading to a farcical standoff where government officials had to cut the lock to regain entry. The press had a field day, painting Carter as a petulant treasure hunter. The legal battle dragged on, but the tide of history was against him. New antiquities laws were swiftly drafted and passed, explicitly designed to keep the Tutankhamun collection intact within Egypt. In the end, Carter was forced to concede. He returned to work under a new agreement that granted the Carnarvon estate only a financial reimbursement for its excavation costs, not a single artifact. The complete, unparalleled collection would stay in Cairo. This political struggle was a watershed moment. It marked the end of an era when the cultural treasures of other nations could be freely divided and exported as spoils. Tutankhamun's gold did more than illuminate the past. It helped forge a modern nation's claim to its own history, setting a precedent that would echo in archaeological digs around the world for the next century. The Golden Mask and the political battles told only part of the story. The king himself remained a silent, resin-coated enigma for decades, his most personal secrets locked within his own bones. That silence was finally broken in 2005, not with chisels and hot knives, but with a hum of invisible energy. For the first time, the mummy of Tutankhamun was carefully removed from its tomb and taken to a mobile CT scanner parked in the Valley of the Kings. This was a scientific pilgrimage, a journey to peer inside the pharaoh without ever touching a single bandage. The scanner took more than 1,700 high-resolution cross-sectional images, creating a perfect digital map of the royal remains. The ancient priests had prepared him for the gods, but now science would prepare his story for the world. What they found dismantled one of history's most tantalizing myths and replaced it with a far more human tragedy. For years, a dramatic theory had captivated the public, the idea that the young king had been murdered. The evidence seemed compelling. An X-ray taken in 1968 appeared to show a bone fragment floating inside the cranial cavity and a possible injury to the back of the skull. It was the perfect plot for a dynastic thriller, a teenage pharaoh struck down by a rival. The 2005 CT scan, with its vastly superior clarity, scrutinized every millimeter of the skull. The truth was less sinister but more definitive. The bone fragment was not loose inside the skull. It was actually part of the first cervical vertebra, and it matched perfectly with other fragments still attached. More importantly, the scan revealed no evidence of swelling or healing around the supposed injury site. The damage to the back of the skull, it was almost certainly post-mortem, likely caused by the embalmers themselves as they extracted the brain, or perhaps even during Howard Carter's difficult extraction decades earlier. The murder theory, it seemed, had been dealt a fatal blow by modern technology. But if he wasn't murdered, what did kill a seemingly healthy young king at around 18 or 19 years of age? The CT scan pointed toward a much more plausible and poignant scenario. The digital autopsy revealed a badly broken left leg, a compound fracture just above the knee. The break was clean and showed signs of minimal healing, indicating it occurred very close to the time of his death. This was a severe injury, one that would have been excruciatingly painful and prone to life-threatening infection. Then the scientists made another startling discovery. Deep within the mummy's tissues, they found genetic traces of the deadliest strain of malaria, Plasmodium falciparum. The evidence suggested Tutankhamun had suffered not just one, but multiple severe malarial infections throughout his short life. So picture the final days not as a palace conspiracy, but as a desperate medical struggle. A young man already weakened by chronic malaria suffers a catastrophic accident, perhaps a fall from a chariot during a hunt. The broken leg becomes infected, a condition the ancient Egyptians had no antibiotics to fight. In his immunocompromised state, the infection rages, possibly turning septic. Fever takes hold, and within days, the boy king is dead. His elaborate burial becomes not just a royal ceremony, but the heartbreaking farewell to a dynasty's last hope, cut down not by treachery, but by a tragic confluence of bad luck, a broken bone, and a mosquito's bite. But the story of his health goes deeper than a single accident. To understand the fragility of the boy king, we must look into his very bloodline, a family tree tangled by power, faith, and a shocking secret. In 2010, a team of scientists undertook a project that would have been pure magic to Howard Carter. They extracted and analyzed the ancient DNA from Tutankhamun and several other royal mummies. This was not a simple task. The genetic material was degraded, contaminated by centuries of handling, and shrouded in ethical debate. But the results, when they finally came, were nothing short of revolutionary. They painted a vivid and intimate portrait of a dynasty clinging to its own power with devastating consequences. The genetic fingerprinting provided a clear answer to the oldest question of all: who are Tutankhamun's parents? For decades, Egyptologists had theorized based on inscriptions and circumstantial evidence. The DNA provided cold, hard proof. His father was the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, the ruler who abandoned Egypt's traditional gods to worship a single solar deity, the Aten. His mother was not Akhenaten's famous queen, Nefertiti, but a mummy known only as the Younger Lady, found in a side chamber of another tomb. And the analysis revealed a bombshell. The genetic markers showed this woman was also Akhenaten's full sister. Tutankhamun was the product of brother-sister incest, a common practice among Egyptian royalty meant to preserve the sacred bloodline, to keep the divine power locked within the family. This single fact explains so much. Generations of such close intermarriage act like a genetic funnel, concentrating not just power but also harmful recessive traits. The CT scan had already shown Tutankhamun had a slightly cleft palate and a club foot, conditions that would have caused him to walk with a cane, several of which were found in his tomb. He likely suffered from Kohler's disease, a painful bone disorder of the foot. His weakened constitution, his susceptibility to the malaria that ravaged his body, all of it points to a young man born with a compromised immune system, a king whose divine blood was also his biological curse. The DNA study did more than identify his parents. It assembled a royal family reunion from the shadows. One of the most enigmatic mummies in Egyptian history, known as the KV-55 mummy, found in a confused and vandalized burial in the Valley of the Kings, was finally given a name. Its genetic profile matched perfectly as both the son of the great pharaoh Amenhotep III and the father of Tutankhamun. This was Akhenaten himself, the revolutionary king, lying not in a glorious tomb but in a reused coffin stripped of its identifying marks. The study also identified the mummies of his probable grandparents and of two fetuses found in Tutankhamun's tomb, his stillborn daughters, whose tiny bodies also showed signs of genetic deformity. This genetic map is a tragic blueprint. It shows a family physically diminishing under the weight of its own ideology, each generation paying a higher price for its isolated divinity. The radical religious revolution of Akhenaten, the return to tradition under Tutankhamun, all that epic history was ultimately played out by a line of individuals whose bodies were failing them. Science, in pulling apart the very molecules of these pharaohs, solved mysteries that inscriptions could never answer. It confirmed theories, shattered myths, and revealed that the greatest threat to the glorious 18th dynasty was not invasion or rebellion, but the slow, quiet accumulation of shared genes in a family that believed it was too sacred to mix with the world outside. The golden mask, the genetic legacy, even the cause of death, all these revelations came from the objects themselves. But what if the objects are not what they seem? A persistent, shadowy theory whispers from the edges of Egyptology, suggesting that Howard Carter's greatest discovery was in fact his greatest creation. The argument goes something like this. Carter, a seasoned dealer and restorer of antiquities, spent years in the Valley of the Kings finding nothing. Facing financial ruin and desperate to please his patron, Lord Carnarvon, he supposedly orchestrated the ultimate con. Using his deep knowledge and connections in the illicit antiquities trade, he could have acquired a collection of genuine but unrelated artifacts. Then, in secret, he planted them in a modest, undecorated tomb, staging the entire discovery from the first step to the final coffin. Proponents of this idea point to supposed red flags. They note that some objects in the tomb show artistic styles from different periods, a possible sign of a haphazard assembly. They question the sheer convenience of the find, a completely intact royal tomb in an area thought to be exhausted. They even scrutinize the famous black and white photographs, suggesting the lighting looks staged or that objects appear too clean. The theory paints Carter not as an archaeologist but as a master forger, constructing a pharaoh's tomb to save his career and cement his legacy. It is a compelling modern mystery, one that taps into our deep-seated skepticism about stories that seem too perfect to be true. But does this audacious idea hold up under the weight of the actual evidence? Let us dismantle it piece by piece, starting with the sheer, staggering scale of the supposed fraud. To forge Tutankhamun's tomb, Carter would have needed to source, transport, and secretly plant over 5,000 individual objects. This was not a handful of statues, it was an entire ecosystem of artifacts, from golden chariots and massive shrines down to the desiccated loaves of bread and the withered floral garlands. Each of these items would have had to be an authentic, high-quality antiquity from the correct time period, a near impossible feat given the rarity of such pieces even on the black market. Then he would have had to orchestrate the planting with a team of workers, every single one of whom would have had to keep the secret for the rest of their lives, despite the global fame and intense scrutiny that followed. The logistical nightmare alone makes the theory almost comically implausible. More damning is the invisible evidence, the chemistry of history. Modern scientific analysis has studied the materials in the tomb in intimate detail. The resins that coated the mummy and fused the coffins together have been analyzed and match the specific plant-based recipes used in the late 18th dynasty. The specific weave of the linen bandages, the composition of the faience, the source of the alabaster, even the pollen found on the floral collar, all of it aligns perfectly with the time and place of Tutankhamun's burial. A forger in the 1920s would have had no knowledge of these microscopic and chemical signatures, no way to replicate them with such flawless accuracy. Perhaps the most powerful refutation, however, lies in the chaos itself. The tomb was not a tidy museum display, it was a jumbled, frantic packing job. Objects were stacked haphazardly, model boats were tossed into the annex, and the burial chamber itself was so crammed with shrines there was barely room to stand. This was not the work of a curator arranging a collection, it was the work of a stressed burial party working against time. A forger, especially one as meticulous as Carter, would have been tempted to create a more orderly, more aesthetically pleasing arrangement. The very disorder of the tomb is one of the strongest proofs of its authenticity. It captures a single, unrehearsed moment in time, a snapshot of ancient urgency frozen in dust and gold. The stylistic inconsistencies pointed to by skeptics are not evidence of a fraud, but rather clues to a turbulent historical period. Tutankhamun reigned during the aftermath of his father Akhenaten's religious revolution. Art from this era often blends traditional styles with the more fluid, naturalistic forms of the Amarna period. The artifacts in the tomb reflect this transition perfectly, showing a society and its craftsmen navigating a return to old gods while still bearing the artistic imprint of recent upheaval. This nuanced historical fingerprint would have been incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for a forger to fabricate with such consistency across thousands of items. In the end, the forgery theory, while a fascinating exercise in skepticism, ultimately collapses under the mountain of evidence it seeks to discredit. It underestimates the complexity of the past and overestimates the capacity of one man to manipulate it. The truth of Tutankhamun's tomb is not found in a conspiracy, but in the overwhelming, interconnected, and often messy reality of the objects themselves. They tell a story far stranger and more human than any forgery could ever hope to be. The king's body held one final, chilling secret. Amidst the golden amulets and jeweled bracelets, the embalmers had left a shocking void. According to every Egyptian funerary text, the heart was the single most important organ. It was not merely a pump, it was the seat of a person's intellect, memory, and very soul. In the Hall of Judgment, the deceased's heart would be placed on a scale against the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth and order. A heavy heart burdened with sin would be devoured by a monster. A light heart, pure and true, would grant its owner eternal life. For this sacred weighing, the heart had to remain with the body. Yet when scientists examined Tutankhamun's remains, they made a grim discovery. His thoracic cavity was empty, the heart was simply gone. This was not the work of tomb robbers. They would have taken gold, not a desiccated organ. This was a deliberate and deeply puzzling omission from the mummification ritual. How could the priests send their king into eternity without his essential passport? One theory suggests a tragic accident. Perhaps the young king died far from the royal embalming workshops, maybe on a military campaign or at a remote palace. By the time his body was transported back, the heart, a soft organ, had already begun to decompose beyond salvage. The embalmers, facing a putrid and unusable heart, might have made the difficult choice to remove it entirely rather than place a corrupted symbol of sin into the sacred scales. They may have believed no heart was better than a heavy one. Another idea points to the religious chaos of his father's reign. Akhenaten's revolution rejected the entire traditional pantheon of gods, including Osiris and the elaborate mythology of the afterlife judgment. In the Aten's singular light, perhaps the old rituals were simplified or forgotten. When Tutankhamun restored the old gods, did the priesthood, still in flux, make a catastrophic error in the mummification procedure? Were they so out of practice with the orthodox rituals that they forgot the heart's paramount importance? Or could this have been a deliberate, albeit desperate, magical workaround? Some Egyptologists ponder a darker possibility. If the king died from a grievous wound to the chest, perhaps from an accident or even combat, the heart itself may have been too damaged to present before the gods. Removing it entirely could have been seen as hiding the evidence of a violent or ignoble death, sparing the king from awkward questions in the divine courtroom. We will never know for certain. The absence screams louder than any artifact. In a tomb where every other conceivable provision was made, from spare sandals to magical Shabti servants, this one glaring omission threatens the entire theological premise of the burial. It hints at panic, at confusion, or at a secret about the king's death so profound that the priests felt compelled to break the most fundamental rule of the journey to the afterlife. The missing heart is the ultimate silent witness, a void where the core of the man was meant to be, leaving us to wonder if the boy king embarked on his eternal voyage fundamentally incomplete, a pharaoh sailing into the darkness without his compass. Buried with the king, resting against his right thigh, was a blade that defied the very age it came from. Among the glittering gold and precious stones, a simple iron dagger seemed almost out of place. But to the ancient Egyptians, this unassuming weapon was arguably the most powerful object in the entire tomb. We live in the Iron Age, a world built on steel, so it is easy to forget a fundamental truth of Tutankhamun's time, the late Bronze Age. In that era, iron was not a common metal, it was a celestial mystery, a substance so rare it was considered more precious than gold itself. Smelting iron from terrestrial ore required furnaces that could reach impossibly high temperatures, a technology that simply did not exist in Egypt at the time. The small amounts of iron they did possess were not mined from the earth, they were collected from the sky. When a meteorite streaked through the atmosphere and crashed into the desert, the resulting fragments were not just lumps of metal, they were divine gifts. The Egyptians called this material iron from the sky, and they believed it carried the essence of the gods. For a pharaoh, a king who was himself considered a living god on earth, to possess a weapon forged from this sacred material was a statement of cosmic power. It connected him directly to the heavens, a literal piece of the stars fashioned into a tool of protection and authority. For decades, this was a compelling theory based on the dagger's existence alone. But in 2016, science provided definitive proof. Researchers used a non-invasive technique called X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, essentially a high-tech scanner that can determine the exact chemical makeup of a material without touching it. They held the scanner over the blade, and the results were astonishing. The iron was not only meteoric in origin, but its specific composition of nickel and cobalt matched known meteorite samples from the region. The analysis left no doubt the dagger on King Tut's leg was crafted from a fallen star. Imagine the moment that raw material was found. A priest or a royal metalsmith would have seen a strange, heavy stone pitted from its fiery descent lying in the sand. They would have recognized it immediately as a sign from the gods. The process of heating and hammering that extraterrestrial metal into a fine, sharp blade would have been a ritual act, a transformation of cosmic power into a terrestrial form. The gold handle, inlaid with delicate granulation and ending in a crystal pommel, was magnificent, but it was merely a fitting for the true treasure, the otherworldly blade it held. This was not merely a functional weapon, it was a symbol of unbreakable divine authority. In the king's hand or at his side in death, it proclaimed that his power was not just of this world, but sanctioned by the very fabric of the cosmos. While other kings might have golden swords, only Tutankhamun, it seems, carried a sliver of the sky. Even the most complete discovery leaves room for the human imagination. Long after Carter's work was done, a tantalizing question lingered in the Valley of the Kings. Was that really all of it? The tomb of Tutankhamun felt strangely small for a pharaoh, especially one buried with such staggering wealth. For decades, Egyptologists whispered a compelling theory. Perhaps the 4 rooms Carter found were merely an antechamber to a larger, still hidden complex. The ultimate prize, some believed, was not Tutankhamun at all, but the lost tomb of his stepmother, the legendary Queen Nefertiti. Her burial place has never been found, and the speculation was that Tutankhamun's modest tomb might be a front, a decoy entrance leading to Nefertiti's grander, secret burial hidden behind a false wall. This was not wild fantasy, but a hypothesis based on the tomb's unusual layout and the political dynamics of the time. In 2015, technology offered a chance to test the theory without swinging a single pickaxe. An Egyptian team, in collaboration with international researchers, brought ground-penetrating radar into the tomb. This device sends harmless radio waves deep into stone, painting a picture of what lies behind walls by measuring density and void. The initial results sent shockwaves through the archaeology world. The scans seemed to show clear, linear anomalies behind the north and west walls of the burial chamber. The data suggested the presence of 2 hidden doorways and large, empty spaces beyond. The announcement was met with global excitement. Had they found Nefertiti's tomb? The possibility was electrifying. For a year, the world held its breath, imagining a second, even greater discovery waiting just inches away from the golden mask. Then came the follow-up in 2016 and again in 2017. More comprehensive scans were conducted by different teams using multiple state-of-the-art radar systems. These subsequent studies were far more thorough, scanning from multiple angles and with greater precision. The results were a sobering counterpoint. The new data found no evidence of hidden chambers, doorways, or voids. The anomalies detected in the first scan, the scientists concluded, were likely natural variations in the limestone bedrock, or perhaps the echoes of workmen's huts and other known tunnels outside the tomb. The dream of a secret chamber, at least for now, was effectively laid to rest, yet this scientific detective story is not a failure. It perfectly illustrates how the story of Tutankhamun's tomb is never truly finished. Each generation brings new tools to the same ancient stones, probing with X-rays, DNA sequencers, and radar waves. The quest shifts from finding new rooms to extracting new information from what we already have. Every scan, every chemical analysis adds another layer to our understanding. The tomb is a puzzle that technology keeps reassembling, revealing a clearer, more complex picture with each attempt. The silence behind those walls today is not an ending but an invitation. It reminds us that some mysteries are solved by finding something, and others are solved, just as importantly, by confirming there is nothing there to find. The absence of Nefertiti's chamber closes one door, but it sharpens the focus on the incredible reality right in front of us. The true secret of the tomb may not be a hidden queen, but the endless capacity of a few small, crowded rooms to keep revealing their stories, one technological whisper at a time. That dagger from the stars was more than a treasure, it was a spark. When the first photographs of the tomb's wonders reached newspapers in 1923, they ignited a global firestorm of fascination that came to be known as Tutmania. The world, weary from war, was desperate for glamour, mystery, and unadulterated splendor. King Tutankhamun delivered all three. Suddenly, ancient Egypt was not just a subject for scholars, it was the height of fashion. Women draped themselves in beaded dresses inspired by the geometric patterns on the tomb's shrines. They wore scarab brooches and headdresses reminiscent of the Golden Mask. Art Deco, the dominant design movement of the era, enthusiastically adopted Egyptian motifs. Sharp, angular patterns echoing hieroglyphs appeared on skyscraper facades in New York and Chicago. Furniture designers crafted chairs with legs shaped like animal paws, and cigarette cases were engraved with stylized sphinxes and lotuses. The discovery permeated popular culture, from jazz songs titled Old King Tut to elaborate Hollywood film sets. This was not a passing trend, it was a full-scale aesthetic invasion, proving that the allure of the pharaohs could shape the modern world's idea of beauty and sophistication. But beneath the glamorous surface, the discovery was triggering a far more profound and lasting revolution in the field of archaeology itself. Howard Carter's methods, for all their modern ambition, were a product of their time. The brutal extraction of the mummy, the use of hot knives and saws, these actions are viewed with horror by today's conservators. Yet, paradoxically, the very spectacle of Tutankhamun's tomb is what made such methods unacceptable forever after. Carter, despite his flaws, understood one revolutionary principle better than almost anyone before him: the importance of context. Previous excavations often treated tombs like treasure chests, ripping out the most beautiful objects for collectors while discarding the broken pottery, the linen wrappings, the very things that told the story. Carter changed that. He insisted on photographing every single item in situ, exactly as it was found before it was moved. He brought in a team of specialists, an anatomist for the mummy, a chemist to analyze the resins, an architect to map the tomb. He understood that the value was not just in the gold, but in the position of a loaf of bread, the weave of a basket, the way a chariot was stacked against a wall. This painstaking, slow process of documentation set a new standard. The world watched, captivated, as each object was revealed not as a solitary trophy, but as a piece of a vast, interconnected puzzle. Tutankhamun's tomb became the first archaeological dig to be a true media event, and in being so, it taught the public that archaeology was about science and story, not just plunder. This shift in perception was monumental. It created a global audience hungry for responsible discovery, an audience that would later support institutions dedicated to preservation. The find also poured rocket fuel on the academic field of Egyptology. Universities saw enrollment in ancient history courses soar. Museums expanded their Egyptian wings. Every child who saw a picture of the Golden Mask dreamed of becoming an archaeologist, ensuring that the next generation of explorers would be larger, more diverse, and better trained. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the treasure became the soul of a nation. For modern Egypt, emerging from centuries of colonial influence, Tutankhamun was a gift of immeasurable power. His artifacts never left the country, becoming the crown jewels of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and now the Grand Egyptian Museum in Giza. They are not just exhibits, they are anchors of national identity, drawing millions of pilgrims from around the world to stand in awe of Egypt's own ancient genius. The boy king, whose name was nearly erased from history, became its most famous ambassador. His tomb did more than reveal the past. It reshaped the modern world's relationship with history, with science, and with the very idea of cultural heritage. From a single stone step hidden beneath the sand to a global symbol of ancient wonder, the journey of King Tutankhamun's tomb is a story that keeps rewriting itself. The real discovery was never just the gold, though its gleam first captured the world's imagination. The true treasure was the time capsule, an impeccably preserved slice of a civilization at a crossroads. Within those 4 cramped rooms, we found the breath of a religion restored, the fingerprints of political turmoil, the intimate drama of a frail dynasty, and a scientific puzzle that continues to yield new clues with every technological advance. Tutankhamun himself was a minor king, a teenager who ruled for only about 9 years during a period his successors tried to erase from history. His name does not appear on the Grand King lists carved on temple walls. And yet, because of the miraculous, intact state of his burial, he has become the most famous pharaoh of them all. His obscurity was his gift to us. While the tombs of greater kings like Ramses the Great were stripped bare by thieves centuries ago, Tutankhamun's modest, overlooked sepulchre sat quietly, preserving for 3,000 years a perfect snapshot of faith, fear, and hope. It allows us to touch not just the divinity of a pharaoh, but the humanity of the people who buried him. They left us the golden mask, but also the wilted flowers. They gave us the dagger from a star, but also the missing heart. Every object, from the grandest shrine to the simplest loaf of bread, is a sentence in a biography the ancient world never intended us to read. So what do you find most fascinating? Is it the political battle over the treasure, the tragic family secrets written in DNA, or the simple, haunting fact that we can gaze upon the face of a boy who lived and died over 3 millennia ago? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe to join us as we continue to explore the deepest mysteries history has left behind.